ergo epikendronete sta agalmata portraitu pu vrethikon stis aneskaphes tis Atheniakis Agoras mia syllogiki prospathia pu perilamvani torinus ke proin fitites. Thamiresti avtoto ergo mazimasopopse stin parosiasitis, portrait statuary in Athens, a view from the Athenian Agora. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, friends, colleagues, and students. I am Bonna Westcoat, Director of the American School of Classical Studies at Athens, and I'm delighted to welcome you here tonight for our 8th and final, alas, lecture on classical archaeology and art history. I would also like to welcome those who follow us online. Our speaker tonight is Sheila Dillon, Anne Murnick-Kogan Distinguished Professor of Art and Art History in the Department of Art, Art History, and Visual Studies at Duke University. She has made major contributions to the field of Greek and Roman portraiture, and particularly to our understanding of female portraiture, with articles and books including The Female Portrait Statue in the Greek World and Ancient Greek Portrait Sculpture. She was a member of the Aphrodisias excavations in Turkey from 1992 to 2004, but I would like to add that she started in the Sanctuary of the Great Gods on Samothrace. Always a good choice. Her current research project centers on the portrait statuary found in the excavations of the Athenian Agora, a collaborative endeavor that involves current and former students. She will share this work with us tonight in her presentation, Portrait Statuary in Athens, a view from the Athenian Agora. Please welcome me in welcoming Sheila.
Thanks, Bonna, so much for the invitation to talk. I didn't realize I was giving the last lecture of the year for art and archaeology, so I hope you all enjoy it. Now, I want to make sure I don't turn off the screen. There we go. Okay. So in his chapter on art in the Greek East under Rome, for a companion to Roman art, Bert Smith posed the following question, quote, "In what senses, if any, can art in the Eastern Mediterranean during the Roman Imperial period be called Roman? Without qualification, perhaps only in the sense of belonging to the Roman period?" Unquote. So my aim in this paper is to explore this question through the lens of Attic portraiture. I consider a broad range of evidence for the subject, including portrait statue bases, marble statuary, and portraits on funerary reliefs. The core of my material comes from the excavations in the Athenian Agora. My primary focus is on the images of the local population, which constituted the vast majority of portrait statues in the city. While scholars typically analyze Athenian portraiture of Roman date through comparisons to portraits from Rome, I argue that this comparative approach has tended to focus on how well these portraits conform, or not, to the history of metropolitan Roman portraiture, while downplaying or disregarding the importance of the long local history of portraiture in Athens itself for understanding this genre of representation. This local history was visible in the large number of older portrait statues still on display in the city in this period, statues that offered a wide range of portrait styles for inspiration and emulation, from idealizing classical period images to the more realistic-looking figures of the Hellenistic period. My contention is that this local visual history profoundly shaped the style and appearance of Attic portraits in the Roman period. That is, even when they adopted aspects of Roman portrait styles, rather than being perceived by their local audience as recognizably and distinctly Roman in their appearance and style, the Roman period portraits of Athenians spoke in a visual language that was locally directed and locally concerned. that the interests and expectations of the local audience and the long tradition of marble carving in Athenian workshops had an effect on the appearance of these images may help to explain the real difficulties scholars have had in identifying with certainty a number of the portraits from the Agora excavations as particular emperors or even as emperors at all. And I just show you 3 examples here. The first one on the left, which is probably the most, Roman-looking portrait from the Agora. Initially, right, identified as Augustus, then as a member of the Julio-Claudian family. Now considered, that is actually by us, so as a portrait of an unnamed private individual. The one in the center, right, initially identified as the Emperor Claudius, then as the priest of the Flavian period by Evelyn Harrison, and now considered on the basis of Klaus Fitchen's identification, and I never disagree with Klaus Fitchen unless I have a really good reason for doing so. This is a portrait of the Emperor Trajan. And then the last guy on the right, variously identified as either sort of resembling Commodus, portrait of Septimius Severus, possibly alias Verus, and I think that is what the tag in the Agora Museum still says today. It's now considered an unnamed, at least by us, private portrait. So fashioning an image that spoke to this local audience in a visual language they understood and were familiar with would seem to have trumped the careful imitation of imperial portrait models from Rome. The material presented here suggests that the adoption of what we now recognize and interpret as distinctly Roman styles of portraiture in the representation of local subjects was not widespread, at least in Athens, until the 2nd century AD. And even then, it is the images of women that appear to have been most affected by these trends. In comparing the Athenian appropriation of its own past under Rome with their contemporaneous adoptions and adaptations of Roman portrait styles and techniques, I hope to show that Greek traditions persisted more strongly than scholars have been inclined to allow. This era of Athenian portraiture was in some ways tied to Roman material culture, and in other ways radically discontinuous from it. Now, the current scholarly narrative of the history of Attic portraiture in the later Hellenistic and Imperial periods, on the other hand, tells a different story from the one I am suggesting here, a story in which Rome plays a defining role. Its broad outlines are as follows. In the early Hellenistic period, there were a whole series of highly individualized and naturalistic portrait statues set up in Athens. The portrait of Menander in the Theater of Dionysus, the statue of Demosthenes in the Athenian Agora, the portrait of Olympiodorus on the Acropolis, and the statue of the new comedy poet Posidippus, perhaps also from the theater. Then, in the 2nd century BC, according to Andrew Stewart's groundbreaking 1979 book Attica, the neoclassical style emerged as the dominant mode for all manner of sculptural production in Athens, including portraiture. The visual evidence of this neoclassical stylistic turn in portraiture rests primarily on the statue of Carneades, the base for which was found in the Agora excavations, with the head preserved in a number of Roman period versions, and the statue of Aristinoe from Rhamnus. Both monuments are dated to around 150 BC. Stewart suggests that the influence of the Roman veristic style, so strongly present beginning in the second half of the 2nd century in the portraits from Delos, only seems to make itself felt in Attic portraiture about a century later, that is, in the second half of the 1st century BC. This is after the sculpture industry in Athens had finally recovered from the disaster of 86 and when Roman presence in the city had increased. In this period, according to Stewart, stylistic eclecticism reigned, and one finds everything from sub-Baroque to Verism to Classicism. To illustrate this eclecticism, Stewart gathered into 2 groups a series of Attic portraits long dated by many scholars to the second half of the 1st century BC. In the first is the well-known head of a priest from the Agora excavations and a series of heads from the National Archaeological Museum. This is what you see at the top. And the second group at the bottom consists of 3 heads, all in the National Museum, which Stewart dated a decade or so later. According to Stewart, no dominant stylistic trend was able to assert itself in Athenian portraiture until the official endorsement of the last of these styles, that is, classicism, by Augustus. That Augustan classicism, the artistic style of the Augustan Cultural Revolution in Rome and Italy, had a profound effect on the material culture of early Imperial Athens, including its portraiture, is a widely held belief. In The Power of Images in the Age of Augustus, Paul Zonker characterized the change and the broad effects of this Romanization in this way, quote, "From the time of Augustus, private portraits, even in the East, consistently display the hairstyles favored by the emperor and other women and men of his house. This in itself was a significant step toward the creation of a uniform imperial culture," unquote. Evelyn Harrison had come to a similar conclusion much earlier in Agora Volume 1. From here, that is the Augustan period, on until the 3rd century, the development of portraiture in Greece apparently followed that of Rome, with little deviation except for a slight lag in time, unquote. The only departure from the emulation of imperial fashion in Attic portraiture comes in the 2nd century AD, during the period of the Second Sophistic, when most scholars allow that some male portrait subjects began to model themselves after the images of late classical and early Hellenistic Athenian intellectuals, as we see in the portraits of the Kosmitai. Now, as I have emphasized this historical narrative, many elements of which go back at least to the 1940s, mostly German scholarship, and the model of stylistic dating that underpins it are still widely accepted in most portrait scholarship. I believe, however, that this narrative is ripe for reassessment, and the question of Roman influence in Attic portraiture, when it made itself felt, its extent, and how it may have been perceived, needs to be reconsidered. Chronology is still, however, a thorny issue. The difficulty in dating Attic portraits based on their style alone is demonstrated by the discrepant dates that scholars have assigned to a number of these heads. For example, the head of a priest in the National Museum, here on your left, has been recently redated by Klaus Fitschen from the 1st century BC to the 3rd century BC. And in his book on Greek sculpture, published in 1990, Andrew Stewart also revised its date to circa 200. Francois Querelle has now argued that the 2 heads from Athens at the center of the slide were made in about 120 BC, on analogy with the so-called bronze-worried man from Delos. And to make things even more complicated and confusing, the fragmentary head in the National Museum on the far right, that was dated by both Gisela Richter and then by Stewart to 50 to 30 BC, is now thought to be Trajanic in date, if not a portrait of Trajan himself. So what does the evidence from the Agora tell us about Attic portraiture in the Roman period? While research is still ongoing, the following premises, drawn from my experience of collaborating on the study and publication of the Roman portrait statuary from Aphrodisias, have guided this project. First, the connection of the Athenian material to the central history of Roman portraiture should be regarded as a hypothesis that needs to be tested, rather than simply taken as an established fact. Preliminary assessment suggests that a range of factors shape the appearance of a portrait, such as the age and gender of the subject, the role in which they were represented, and how they may have positioned themselves personally with regard to the Hellenic past and the imperial present. Second, while in many cases we cannot recover the precise display locations of the portraits found in the Agora excavations, we can be reasonably certain that they all come from Athens. And it is within this local context, which had its own history and traditions, that these images need first to be understood. Finally, as already alluded to, the chronology of much of this material is still unclear. Some technical details are useful for dating purposes. A rasped surface, even on the flesh, seems to be indicative of Roman period rather than Hellenistic production. Drilled eyes appear to be widespread by about the mid-2nd century AD, and portrait busts can be broadly dated by their form. The notion, however, that one can easily tell the difference between a portrait of the later Hellenistic period from one of the early Imperial period, or that one can date every portrait more or less closely to a particular emperor's reign, is an article of faith rather than a demonstrable fact. These portrait subjects had a range of representational possibilities available to them from which they might choose. To suggest that they all simply followed the fashion set by the imperial family in Rome is to deprive these subjects of their agency and their portraits of their historical interest. As I have stated, the idea that portraiture in Athens fundamentally changed in the late first century BC due to Roman influence, and that from the very beginning of the imperial period, the images of local subjects emulated portrait styles of the imperial family, is widespread in the scholarship. And the notion of a significant imperial presence in the statue landscape of the Agora, already in the early 1st century AD, is either explicitly stated or at least strongly implied, when it is said that, quote, honorific images of the imperial family began to crowd the Agora, unquote. But when we consider the epigraphic evidence found in the Agora excavations, I believe a more nuanced picture emerges. Statues of the imperial family are represented by about 24 inscribed portrait statue bases found in the Agora excavations. These bases date from the mid-1st century BC to the early 3rd century AD. It is not clear, however, whether all or even most of these statues originally stood in the Agora, as the majority of these bases, some of them extremely fragmentary, were found in post-antique or modern contexts, and therefore could easily have migrated into the excavation from elsewhere. That is, we are working on the assumption that unless an inscribed statue base was found in an authentically ancient context, it should not be assumed that the statue originally stood in the Agora. Based on this more minimalist approach to the archaeological evidence, we can only be sure that the inscribed bases for 6 imperial portraits are from statues that actually stood in the area of the Agora. These included a bronze statue of Julius Caesar, a column monument for Tiberius before he became emperor, the chariot monument to Attalus II in front of that king Stoa that was reinscribed in honor of Tiberius as emperor, a statue of Livia as Artemis Boulaya, which probably stood either in the Bouleuterian precinct or in the southwest temple, the statue of Claudius as Apollo Petroas, which is thought to have stood in the temple to that god, although it was found in the post-Herulian wall, and a base for the statue of Trajan, still in the wall of room 3 of the street Stoa near the Library of Pantinus. These 6 statues, 3 of which appear to have stood in interior spaces and not on the open square, hardly constitute a crowd of images of the imperial family in the Agora. Even if we widen our perspective and consider the city as a whole, it is clear that throughout Athens' history, the statues of the Roman emperors were in the distinct minority in the sculptural landscape, which was also the case at Aphrodisias. Leaving aside the portraits of Hadrian, which clearly constitute a special case, only 38 bases for portrait statues of emperors, from Augustus to Commodus, are documented from Athens in a 2005 study of imperial statue bases. In a 2010 study of statue bases from the Acropolis, 26 are for emperors or members of their family, while there are 132 statue bases for non-imperial honorans. And of the approximately 250 statue bases of the imperial period from Eleusis, Clinton's catalog includes only about 21 for emperors or their family members. The sculptural evidence from the Agora points in a similar direction. There are only 5 portraits found in the excavations currently identified as images of emperors, all of which date to the 2nd century AD. These include the many fragments of 2 armored statues, both perhaps of Trajan, from the street stoa. You see one of these, right, S2518 on the left. An over life-size head of Trajan likely belongs to one of these statues. The headless armored statue of Hadrian, a well-preserved bust of Antoninus Pius, also wearing armor from a late antique domestic context, and a small fragment of a cuirass bust that must also be from the portrait of an emperor, perhaps Marcus Aurelius or Lucius Verus. Of this material evidence, we can only be certain that the statues of Trajan and Hadrian originally stood in the area of the Agora. The busts come from late contexts and could easily have been brought in from elsewhere, and their format suggests that they were originally meant for interior display. If we turn to the evidence for the portraits of non-imperial subjects, we have much more material, both epigraphic and sculptural, to consider. First, there are many more statue bases for portraits of Athenians found in the Agora excavations than there are for members of the imperial family, and a good number of these statue bases were built into the post-Herodian wall, which is a strong indication that these monuments originally stood in the Agora. These include, for example, a late 2nd century portrait statue of Claudius Sospis, an altar priest of the Eleusinian Mysteries, a portrait of Herodes Atticus, set up by one of the Athenian tribes, and a statue set up in the late 1st century BC by the Boulae and the Deimos of the hoplite general Xenocles of Rhamnus, which stood on a high column. I wish I could show you more. They tend not to be very photogenic, the bases from the Agora. The inscriptions on the bases show that these Roman period statue dedications generally follow the patterns that we see in the Hellenistic period. Private portrait monuments are set up by family members or other individuals, and public honorific statues are set up by the Deimos and the Boulae, sometimes now joined by the Areopagus, with corporate groups such as the merchants, ephebes, and tribes also continuing to authorize statue awards. The statues themselves continue to be set up for the usual reasons, in honor of religious activity, athletic victory, or fulfilling important public offices. Continuing a tradition that also began in the Hellenistic period, women and girls are honored with statues for their religious participation. The bases themselves, the layout and organization of the inscription, and I will point out almost always in Greek, I think there's probably about 2 maybe Latin inscriptions from the Agora, or at least that are readily published. So the layout and organization of the inscription and the forms of the monuments seem not to change substantially between the Hellenistic and Roman periods, although this topic has yet to be the focus of detailed research and therefore needs more study. Initial observations suggest that in most cases, the Roman period texts follow the formula that became standard in the Hellenistic period. So the name of the dedicator in the nominative case, the name of the honorand in the accusative case, and the reasons for the honor. There are, of course, some differences. For example, many fewer of the Roman period bases from the Agora are signed by the sculptor who made the statue. In the small number of instances where we know the material of the statue based on the cuttings for its attachment, the material was invariably bronze. So what about the sculptural evidence, almost all of which is, of course, made of marble? As with statue bases, the overwhelming majority of portraits found in the Agora excavations represent local, that is, non-imperial subjects. Most of the portraits appear to date to the 2nd and early 3rd centuries. Of the approximately 115 portrait heads that we have cataloged so far, about 25% represent women, which is weirdly or interestingly enough, this is the same percentage of marble female portraits that we found from Aphrodisias. One well-preserved female head, which has been dated to the early 1st century AD, gives us some sense, if that date is indeed correct, of early imperial period female portrait styles. The head, which was found in Herulaean destruction debris near the remains of the 2nd century Roman nymphaeon, was worked for insertion into a draped statue body. The head belongs with the right hand holding a fiale, which suggests the subject was a priestess. In her description of the portrait, Evelyn Harrison emphasized its classicizing elements: the oval-shaped face, tapering to the chin, the strongly idealized facial features, the smooth forehead, large almond-shaped eyes, the nose nearly straight in profile, the small, delicate mouth with gently parted lips. The hair is worn center-parted with fine waves framing the face, gathered into a ponytail at the nape of the neck. Because of the hairstyle, Harrison compared the head to images of Antonio Minor and dated the portrait to the Julio-Claudian period. But this hairstyle can also be found on much earlier local images. It is frequently worn, for example, by young women on attic gravestones of the classical period, a selection of which I show you here. And the face of the Agora portrait, as Harrison herself remarked, has none of the physiognomic particularities one sees in the portraits of Antonia. Rather than comparing the head to Roman imperial portraits, with which I would argue it has little in common, its simple hairstyle and idealized beautiful face fit much more comfortably within the long local history of idealized female portrait representation. That is, there is nothing especially Roman about this head, other than the fact that it is dated to the Roman period. A beautifully preserved bust of a young woman from a late antique house shows more obvious Roman influences, but also a certain independence from central models, in addition to hallmarks of a distinctly local sculptural technique. The coiled bun placed high on the back of the head is reminiscent of the hairstyles of the Empress Sabina and Faustina Maior, but is clearly not closely modeled on either. The hair framing the face, springing up over the forehead in a kind of anastolie and combed back in long, gently waving strands, is an arrangement one rarely finds in female portraits in the West. Such a style does occur, however, in works from Athens and Greece. For example, in this very high-quality fragmentary female portrait in the Metropolitan Museum in New York on the right, which reportedly comes from Athens. In addition, the careful carving with the chisel of the strands of hair framing the face in both portraits, without any trace of the drill, is characteristic of the finest attic portraits of the later 2nd century, at a time when most metropolitan Roman portraits deploy an ostentatious use of the drill. Like the female head discussed previously, the style and appearance of the portrait bust of a youth is also best understood in comparison to earlier Greek portrait traditions, as Harrison herself recognized. The nude portrait bust, which may originally have been set into a herm, was found in a large Roman period house on the northeast slope of the Hill of the Nymphs, among burnt debris from the Herulian sack. It depicts a youth with short curly hair and fuzzy sideburns on his cheeks, suggesting the beginnings of a beard. The portrait is not particularly individualized, and as Harrison noted in her publication of the portrait, quote, "The face seems influenced by the classical ephebe type of the 4th century BC," unquote. While Harrison dated this portrait to the time of Nero, based on the form of the bust and not on the style of the portrait itself, the head is indeed typical of other Roman period portraits of youths from the Greek East that tend to be disconnected from imperial portrait fashions, and therefore are very difficult to date with any precision. Rather than influence from Rome, this group followed in the stylistic tradition of the portrait images of youths and ephebes, mainly established in the Hellenistic period. For example, in this portrait, statue of Cleonicus, son of Lysandrus, set up by his brother in the gymnasium in Eretria, as well as the many youths similarly depicted in a gymnasium context on Hellenistic grave reliefs. This disconnect from the central imperial portrait models continues in the 2nd century AD. 2 examples from the Agora excavations illustrate well the possibility of an alternative to the emperor-driven period face model that has shaped the scholarship for so long. The first is the portrait herm of Morgenes, found in Herulian destruction debris in a house on the Kolonos Agoraios. This portrait is one of the vanishingly few examples from the Agora of a local Athenian whose name we actually know. Its near pristine condition and smaller than life-size scale, both unusual for portrait herms, suggest an interior display context. The portrait was initially dated by Harrison to the Hadrianic period, given what she calls his Trajanic face type, combined with his drilled eyes. Although a Morrigenes from the same tribe is mentioned in a Prytany list of circa 170 AD, Harrison did not think they could be the same person, as she thought that this date was too late for the style of the portrait. Her dating was based on two widely accepted premises. One, that drilled eye markings must mean a Hadrianic or later date, and two, that after Hadrian, mature men were always represented wearing a beard. Based on the technique and style of portraits from Aphrodisias, however, Birdsmith has now argued that a whole series of portraits from the Greek East that have both drilled eyes and are clean-shaven were more likely mid to later 2nd century AD in date, including our Morrigenes, as well as the wreathed portrait from the Agora on the right, which Harrison had dated to the mid-3rd century. While all these portraits utilize the contemporary enlivening sculptural technique of drilled eyes, their subjects chose to represent themselves in a more traditional, old-fashioned style of the clean-shaven elder. Although wearing a beard was clearly the default choice after Hadrian, for most mature males, not everyone was a slave to this fashion. Therefore, there is in fact no reason why the Morrigenes of the portrait herm cannot be the Morrigenes of the later 2nd century Prytany list. One final example of men going their own way style-wise is the well-preserved, high-quality bust of this young man on the left, found in what appears to be a late Roman context beneath the collapsed north retaining wall of the city Eleusinion. He was found together with an even more exquisitely finished, but unfortunately headless, female bust on the right, with whom he is thought to form a pair. And I think it's a real shame that she's downstairs in the basement because she doesn't have a head. And he's upstairs on display in the museum because she is way better carved than he is. But there we go. Just telling you, John. Just take a note. So, the portrait subject wears his hair in long, thin strands that lie flat on the skull, leaving the ears uncovered and ending in a fringe of pointed locks across the forehead. The burgeoning beard extends down the cheeks and under the chin, while the chin itself is smooth and hairless. A nascent mustache graces the upper lip. The very large, expressive eyes are framed by thick brows that meet in the middle at the root of the hooked nose. The costume of the bust consists of a hymation of thick and deeply carved folds, worn high around the back of the neck, with a chiton underneath. The portrait was dated by Harrison to the mid-3rd century AD, as she thought that the portraits of the Emperor Gallienus provided the best parallel for the style of the hair, although she did note that the facial features, quote, recall Greek work of the period rather than the art of the capital, unquote. Now, more recently, Klaus Fitchen has argued that the architecture and workmanship of the bust suggests that the Agora portrait was made by a local Attic workshop active in the mid to later 2nd century, the same workshop that made the portrait busts of Herodes Atticus and Polydeukion from Kephistia. As the form of portrait busts seemed to be a more reliable indicator of date, particularly when dealing with images of non-imperial subjects, we should, I would argue, place this portrait bust in the second half of the 2nd century, as Fitchen does, rather than in the 3rd with Harrison. The portrait's short, simple, and seemingly unstyled hairstyle is one that is frequently worn throughout the Roman period by male figures on Attic tombstones, to which I now turn. Attic tombstones of the Roman period are an important body of comparative material to consider in evaluating portrait representation in Athens. The sample size is much larger, and the tombstones also give us good evidence for the range of portrait costumes. as only a handful of portrait statue bodies have been found in the Agora excavations. Like the portraits from the Agora, few of the images on these stelae appear to adopt the so-called period face of Roman imperial portraiture. Many of the portraits, both male and female, tend to avoid physiognomic particularity in favor of a more blandly classicizing facial features. Women, particularly young women, do sometimes adopt Roman fashion hairstyles, although even when they do so, there is a tendency not to reproduce imperial models precisely. In fact, the most popular female hairstyle in funerary stelae throughout the Roman period is not a Roman fashion hairstyle at all, but one that is well known from classical and Hellenistic funerary reliefs. That is, hair parted at the center with a crown of waves framing the face and gathered into a small bun or ponytail at the nape of the neck, like the female portrait head from the Agora discussed previously. Nope, I'm going to go back one. Okay, that's fine. Male funerary portraits of all age groups, on the other hand, appear to have been much less likely in general to imitate imperial portrait fashions, which is a trend one finds in the portrait sculpture from the Agora. The most common hairstyle, worn by both mature and young men from the Augustan to the Antonine period, has the hair come forward from the crown, lying mostly flat against the skull, and arranged in a fringe across the forehead. That is, not all that different from the male bust already discussed. While this hairstyle is thought to have its roots in the early imperial period, it also harkens back to an earlier time, the plain hairstyles worn by men and youth on classical Attic tombstones. This return to the classical past is particularly obvious in Attic stelae dated to the 2nd century AD, when such retrospective male styling is also found in Attic portrait sculpture. The funerary stele of Paramenos and his son Alexandros, dated to the mid-2nd century AD, is a clear example of this retrospective tendency. The figure of Paramenos in particular, with the plain hairstyle, full mustache and beard, classicizing facial features, hemation suit, and arm-sling posture, would not have been out of place on a stele from classical Athens. It should also be noted that no Roman period funerary reliefs with men wearing the toga have been recovered from Athens. While many Athenians held Roman citizenship, particularly in the high imperial period, they seem not to have advertised this status visually in their funerary portraiture. The same appears to have been true for public portrait statues. I have found no togate statues among the sculpture recovered in the Agora excavations. There are, in fact, only a handful of togate statues from all of Athens, and at least 2 of these, both from Eleusis, appear to represent members of the imperial family. All of this is not to deny that there were changes in the production of portraiture and other types of sculpture in Athens in the Roman period, as there clearly were. These included an increased use of marble for portrait statues, an increase in the number of portrait herms, a format that may have gained in popularity due to Attic sculptural production for the Roman villa market, the widespread use of the portrait bust as a display format, and the adoption of Roman fashion hairstyles, particularly in the 2nd century AD, and principally, at least on Attic tombstones, when different generations, such as mother and daughter, are represented together. But there was also a significant stylistic continuity with the portrait sculpture of the past, much of which was still on display. The classical past was visibly present in the city's monuments. A direct connection to the classical past was also proudly proclaimed on some portrait statue bases. A recently published portrait monument from the Agora of the late 2nd or early 3rd century AD that represents 3 family members, a husband, wife, and daughter, proudly names the wife as a descendant of Pericles in the 21st generation. Other portrait statue monuments of the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, all from Eleusis, also trace the lineage of the Athenian women represented to illustrious figures of the 5th and 4th century BC. One traces her lineage back to Pericles, another to both Conon and Callimachus, and a third, somewhat surprisingly, I thought at least to me, to Pericles, Conon, and Alexander the Great. While claims to such noble ancestry seem to be more common in high imperial period Athens, especially among Eleusinian families, they also occur in the Hellenistic period. The inscription on the base for the statue of Philtera, priestess of Athena Polias in the mid-2nd century BC, celebrates her ties by descent to the great Athenian 4th century order and statesman Lycurgus. The famous line of Faulkner comes to mind, quote, "The past is never dead, it's not even past," unquote. In conclusion, Bert Smith has proposed the following way of seeing a wide swath of artistic production in the Greek East during the Roman period. Quote, "Much of what was new and different in the visual and monumental culture of the Greek East was due in some way to Rome. At the same time, however, little of it was intended or probably experienced by contemporaries as anything other than, in political cultural terms, neutral, local, or Hellenic," unquote. Although we still need to untangle and to elucidate the various strands of influence affecting and shaping the portraits of local Athenians in the Roman period, that is, what precisely was due to Rome and what was due to a continuing Hellenism, I believe the interpretive framework that analyzes these images by default in relation to imperial portraiture is not the most productive way in which to understand them. Local stylistic traditions, the long history of Athenian portrait production, and the images from earlier periods that were still standing in the city are just as, if not more, relevant. Even in the high imperial period, when one might argue that because of Hadrian's interventions, Athens finally became a Roman city, much of Athenian portraiture characterized its citizens in ways that would have been both familiar and intelligible to the citizens of the classical past. Finally, I want to make clear, lest anyone get the wrong impression, that my aim is certainly not to point out how many things Eve Harrison may have gotten wrong. In many ways, her Roman portrait volume was way ahead of its time. For example, she argued for the value of having to come to terms with a mass of material from a particular excavation, rather than simply cherry-picking from among the best preserved examples on display in a museum. And she carefully documented the fine spots of the sculpture. These were two guiding principles of the Aphrodisias portrait study. And many of her astute observations about the Agora portraits have stood the test of time. But we also do well to remember that in 1949 and 1950, when she was working on this project, which was her dissertation, she was laboring under a distinct disadvantage. There were no galleries of Roman sculpture in the National Archaeological Museum or the Acropolis Museum, no well-illustrated catalogs of Roman portraits from Athens or elsewhere in Greece. As much of this comparative material lay unpublished in storerooms. Harrison herself recognized the difficulty of the situation and expressed hope that her study might inspire others to take an interest in this material. And of course, the field of Roman portraiture has changed significantly in the 70 years since the publication of Agora I. Despite these limitations, Evelyn Harrison produced a study that I still consult and indeed learn from on a daily basis. My only hope is that our project lives up to her very high standards, and I only wish she was still here to see it. Thank you. A lot of text on there, so that's us to stay up for a while.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your presentation, and I would like to open the floor for questions, both from the audience and online. We do have one online, they're pouring in online. Let me turn there while people in the audience think. The first is from Tony Usabelli. Is there sufficient evidence of statue polychromy to inform any conclusions concerning attribution, date, or Greek versus Roman influence?
So not that I know of yet, although, in speaking to Mark Abe, who worked at Aphrodisias, there are ways that, we could probably see about sussing out any polychromy on the sculptures. The other issue, too, is the marble provenancing. Most of the stuff is said to be Pentelic, but there is some Thasian marble lurking, and also Parian, so it would be good to understand for sure, right, the difference and what we're actually working with. But no, I don't have good evidence for polychromy.
I think Susan's got a question.
If there was going to be an imperial portrait in the Agora, would Rome send out that portrait, or would it be sculpted by a local guy who'd picked up the right style, or what? What went on in the sculptor's workshop for that?
Well, we don't really know, Susan. So most of it is derived from the pieces themselves, right? So that's the evidence that we have for sort of the imperial portrait, right? How this kind of thing worked. So it's clear that there were made available models from Rome, right? And these probably could either be in drawings, in like two-dimensional kind of representations, in three-dimensional representations. But it wasn't this kind of top-down thing. So yes, I mean they would be made available, right? And then the sculptors, who are local sculptors, right, will, sort of just like make, I mean, so this is one of the difficulties, like especially that head of Trajan, which has gone through so many different iterations of who it actually is. And Hans Goethe thinks it's reworked. That's another, possible issue with it. In other words, the sculptors working in Athens, right, are working within a tradition which is fairly well established and for a very long time. So that tradition is going to, by its very nature, just affect the way, right, that they make these things. Which, I would love to see what the head of Hadrian that was on that the armored statue actually looked like, and if it would be like a dead ringer, right, for the other statues of portraits of Hadrian. It's hard to say. So.
No, because it seems like it would be impossible for someone from one tradition to make a perfect copy of the model, that there would be something of his own tradition of craft that would stay there, and I'd wondered if you'd been able to, well, you're looking for that, I guess.
So I think you can trace those if you look at sort of, a representation of an emperor, like, what's his name, Dietrich Boschung, who's gathered all of the images of Augustus, right, which are, they're the most, I think, other than maybe Hadrian, that we have. And you can see sort of, okay, which are the ones that are made in Rome and which are the ones that are made in the Greek East, and the variations. So there can be more variations in the Greek East, but it's not necessarily the case. There can be real, very precise models. I guess it depends on what the patron wanted, right? How much they were concerned about getting something, because you'll work on they always have a label, so, there's no, but for the most part, you can, when you see Augustus, you can sort of, like, if you spend 20 minutes looking through, the Capitoline catalog of the portraits of Hadrian or something like that. You just spend a couple of minutes. I mean, you can pretty much tell Hadrian like in 50 paces if you walk into a museum, because it's a very distinctive image. And they also tend to be much more concerned with sort of getting the front of the face, and then as you get to the back of the head, it's like all bets are off, right? Because who looks at the back of the statue? So, it's a little bit more flexible. Yeah. Yeah, Julia.
To follow up about Hadrian, Hadrian, of course, there's one Hadrian statue prominently in the Agora that you didn't talk about, that we would also like to know a lot about, wouldn't we? And that's the eponymous hero statue. And it's quite possible that that statue showed a very different kind of Hadrian than the torso that was found by Scheer Sr.
I mean, the body would have been very different. Yeah.
Well, and
more
possibly
heroic or something like that.
yeah, and possibly even the face. I mean, maybe would it? I mean, would it have looked like Hadrian at 50 paces as the Hadrians in the Capitoline Museum?
I think so. I think it would.
Well,
I mean, for portraits of Hadrian, they're really not that. I mean, this is in portrait scholarship. It's like that's the worst emperor to work on because it's so boring, because they're all so similar, right? And so there isn't this sort of mass. I mean, there are a couple of different types and stuff like that, but they all sort of look the same. So I think it would have looked the same. But maybe you're right, like not an armored statue, but like a heroic, statue probably to go. But I mean, it's difficult enough in dealing with the material that is preserved in the Agora rather than trying to understand sort of all that stuff that we actually don't have.
No, of course it is. And of course also, and this is what I found so fascinating about your talk, is that it intersects very, very nicely with the discussions coming out of the Second Sophistic, and particularly that started with Simon Goldhill's edited volume, Being Greek Under Rome, with things that I've talked about elsewhere. And it fits in really, really nicely with this issue of how are you Athenian under Rome, which just still hasn't received as much discussion as it might. And that's what I thought was really fascinating about your talk tonight.
Well, thank you. I will say, though, I've started to rethink about the Kosmite portraits, right? So there is this overwhelming kind of narrative, which basically started with Zonker, but also coming out, right, of all of the work that's been done on the Second Sophistic, Goldhill, and, the bibliography is just immense. That there's like a Rome pole, right? And then there's late classical Hellenistic intellectual pole. And these are the two kind of ways in which they sort of break down those portraits. And there's a great focus, right, on the fact that they are kosmites, right? Which I think is a slightly wrong way of looking at them. In other words, what they really are, and this does come across, although not quite as sort of emphatic as I would like to in the Hadrianos catalog, right, where we have all these new beautiful photographs of the Kosmite portraits, is that these are not really portraits of Kosmites, right? What these portraits are of elite Athenians who happen to have served as a Kosmites. And that is what is preserved to us. So I think what they do is give sort of a really good, broad understanding of the range, right, of portrait representation in the 2nd and 3rd century AD. And it's not so much this kind of focus on that they're intellectuals. Yeah, some of them are riffing on Aeschines and things like that. But I think they've sort of straitjacketed them a little bit more than I would like. But they're really important. They're really important.
Yes. That's all I'm going to say. Yes. We can take this up later.
Okay.
We do have more online. If I could just let you know that Elena Pardita says you are as fascinating to listen to as you are to read. Melissa Barden-Dowling writes, Professor Dillon, could you please return to the percentage of portraits that were of women and girls? Are these male-female percentages similar to other cities in the Roman era?
I have no idea. I mean, it was just something actually when I was sort of working on this lecture this week, that I was looking at the Aphrodisias catalog, and they say, we say in there that 25%, right? The epigraphic evidence is a little bit different, but the sculptural evidence basically is 25%. And so I thought, oh, well, like, what's the percentage of our stuff? And so I just sort of went and kind of, and truthfully, 115, that's how many we've cataloged. There may be more. So I don't know the answer to that question. I will say 25%, when you think about it, is pretty high. What's the percentage of female statues standing in the United States of America, or for that example, in Statuary Hall in the Capitol? Certainly not 25%. So, yeah.
Okay. Barbara Burrell writes, congratulations for an excellent talk. And also, how do you account for or date the veristic or non-idealized portraits of women?
Yeah. Yeah, dating. I mean, this is something that we actually really have to come to terms with, because my colleagues who are helping me work on this project are refusing to put forward any dates whatsoever. They're just leaving the date blank. And, although I'm sympathetic to that in some ways, I just don't really think that that's going to sort of make it in the publication world. Dating by style, right? I mean, this is part, yes, of course, we want to know, I mean, those are like the two most important things that you deal with when you deal with portraiture is who is it and what's its date, right? And then you just like move on, because that's all you actually need to know about these things. I mean, we don't have that information, right? The Morigenes is like the only identified portrait of an Athenian subject, as far as I know, from the Agora. So that's why I think the Kosmite portraits may provide some kind of armature, right, on which to start building a local Athenian chronology. But every time I go into the National Museum, the damn room is closed. And also, the lights in there. I mean, Jesus, you can't like get up close to the thing. I mean, it's a horrible place to actually study sculpture. They'll let you in, so if you, just to let you guys know, if you go there and you want to get into that room, just go up to the desk and say you want to get into that room, and they'll let you in. But they are like nervous if you stay in there for too long, So, because I guess you're just supposed to go and look and then leave or something like that. And of course, some of them are like really high up, so you can't see them. So that's the other difficulty. But that aside, I do think that but that doesn't help with the women. Yeah. I think we're probably going to say broadly 1st century AD or 2nd century AD or something like that. I mean, this is basically what we had to do at Aphrodisias as well, is that these things could only really be very broadly dated unless there was some kind of context that you could attach it to.
Okay,
Jackson had a
Jackson.
question.
So thank you so much for that talk. So my question is, do you think that Athens, or the situation, I guess, elsewhere, was similar to what was happening in Athens, where they're referencing kind of their local styles, or is Athens more of has this privileged position as being Athens?
So Athens seems, I mean, what's going on in Aphrodisias does seem to have similar kinds of reminiscences in Athens. Corinth seems to me to be something completely different, right? And I will say, so went and saw some of the portraits in the Corinth storerooms. They're really good. They're much better than the stuff that we actually have in the Agora. I mean, they're just, fabulous, fabulous, fabulous stuff. And lots of different marble and things like that. I mean, just a much richer thing. And I think what my guess would be there, right, is because it's a Roman colony. They're sort of like much more attuned to what's going on in Rome. Not that the Athenians weren't attuned to what is going on in Rome. It's complicated. So Thessaloniki too, right, seems to be a bit different, right? Sort of more following Roman models. It is, I don't know, it is strange the dearth of imperial portraits from Athens. They're just not that many.
Thanks.
Okay. We'll take another online question, if that's all right with you. Martha Payne says, NAM 3294, I hope you know who that is thought to be a Trajan, but there is not beard that I can see. Are there many portraits of Trajan without a beard for comparison? I think Trajan should always have a beard.
Portraits of Trajan have a beard.
Yeah. Okay, so let's go on to an anonymous attendee who asks, we know it was quite a deal in classical Athens to have a portrait statue in the Agora. In Roman imperial times, was it still a big deal for Athenians, other than emperors and his family, like for local people? And I might maybe just also ask, is the Agora the central place for portraiture in the Roman period in Athens?
Absolutely. Agora is the most important site for portraiture in Athens in every period. So so there is this notion, which is what I tried to, in looking at all of the statue bases from the post-Herulian wall, and there are about 50 of them, and they're pretty big. And so my argument is that those you can be most confident, right, were set up somewhere in the actual square itself. And what they show is that, up until the time of the Herulian sack, the Agora is a prestigious place to set up portrait monuments. It's not this museum like they talk about if you just read Pausanias, right? It's like a museum. No, I mean, this was a vibrant and thriving context for the setting up of honorific monuments well into the 3rd century. That answer the question, I think.
Okay, thank you. We have a request for a reference from Harriet Weiss, who says the inscriptions of Athenian and Eleusinian women claiming descent from Pericles and other early figures of note. Is there a publication where she might find more information on that?
So Kevin Clinton is the one who has published all of the, the Eleusinian inscriptions. The one this monument that comes from the Agora, I think he published in 2007, if I'm right, in Hesperia. So there's Hesperia, and then his 3 volumes of inscriptions from Eleusis.
Okay, that's a good place to start, for sure.
I'll take you a while to get there.
All right, let me continue online. This is from an anonymous attendee. The main problem concerning the Cosmates portraits in the National Archaeological Museum, Athens, is the absence of their original bases with the name of the depicted persons. One should look for them in the epigraphical museums. I guess that's not a question, but a comment. Yeah.
Ah, okay.
All right, and Doxy.
Sounds good. That sounds good. Yep.
Do we have other questions from the audience? If not, then I'd like to thank Sheila and invite you all to have a glass of wine with us.
Don't you just love that? So